We are very excited to be here today with Dr. Neal Barnard. Now, Dr. Neal Barnard is an adjunct associate professor of medicine at the George Washington University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C., and he is the president of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, otherwise known as PCRM. Dr. Barnard is an absolute legend, and he has led numerous research studies investigating the effects of diet on diabetes, body weight, chronic pain, and he's also performed groundbreaking studies of plant-based dietary interventions in patients specifically living with type 2 diabetes. Dr. Barnard has authored more than 80 scientific publications and 20 books for scientists as well as the general public. His brand new book will be available in early February, and this book is called Your Body in Balance. As president of the Physicians Committee, Dr. Barnard leads programs advocating for preventative medicine, for good nutrition, and for higher ethical standards in research. He has hosted 4 PBS television programs on nutrition and health, and his research has contributed to the acceptance of plant-based diets in the dietary guidelines for Americans, which I'm sure was no small task. Dr. Barnard is one of our heroes and a true leader in the world of plant-based nutrition for both human health as well as for animal rights. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Barnard.
Well, thank you so much for all you do, and it's great to be talking with you again.
Absolutely love it. So this is your 4th time on the Mastering Diabetes Online Summit, and people absolutely love what you have to say. So we're going to ask some pretty fun questions here today and go into a lot of detail about insulin resistance, low carbohydrate diet, and beyond. So first question for you is, researchers are now talking about another form of diabetes, which the general public doesn't really know that much about, called type 3 diabetes, which is either associated with Alzheimer's disease or is Alzheimer's disease. So can you tell us a little bit more about what type 3 diabetes is?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. This is really the new frontier. And we have probably more questions than answers, but where we're coming to is this. Alzheimer's disease used to be thought of as all about genes and old age. If you had certain genetic traits, the ApoE4 allele, this will not be on the test, but if you had that gene from one parent, your risk of Alzheimer's was tripled. If you got it from both parents, you had 10 to 15 times higher risk of developing Alzheimer's. And so it looked like it was all genetic. However, along the way, people started studying food patterns and found that even if you had that genetic loading, if you ate in a certain way, in a healthier way, if you avoided the animal fats, for example, saturated fat, your risk of memory problems in older age was dramatically reduced as much as 80% in certain studies. So that led us to believe it's not all just genes and old age, or if it is, foods are somehow changing the gene expression. And the reason that diabetes comes into it is that we're thinking about, of course, how insulin affects glycemic control. There is also the question of vascular damage that can occur, which occurs with all forms of diabetes, where the blood vessels are attacked by this. And so the concern is that something that's happening not just in the body tissues, but is also happening in the brain, relates to this dysfunctional insulin metabolism. Now, my view of this is that we need a lot more study before we can make definitive conclusions about cause and effect. However, we have known for a long time that people with diabetes have about double the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to other people. I'm going to change my diet to control my diabetes. Maybe that will also help reduce my risk of Alzheimer's disease.
Okay, so this is great actually, because I've actually read a little bit about type 3 diabetes as well, and some researchers refer to it as diabetes of the brain or insulin resistance of the brain. So could you go a little bit about the sort of connection between insulin resistance and vascular health inside of your brain?
I have to say, I want to be cautious about this because I cannot tell yet if insulin is the good guy or the bad guy here when it comes to the brain. And forgive me for being unsure about this. Insulin is something that we absolutely need. Insulin helps, obviously, glucose to enter the cells. If you are insulin resistant in your muscles and your liver cells, your insulin level goes up. That's a good thing in that it compensates. But we now what I cannot tell, what I do not know, and what I want to hedge on yet for now is whether the brain effects are the result of too little insulin, where we're just not making we're not getting adequate insulin action, or having too much insulin, some kind of insulin toxicity. So I'm hoping if you have me on a fifth time, I will have more definitive knowledge about this. But for now, I really feel very much like a student of trying to understand and trying to tease apart how the glycemic machinery is involved in this, because we used to have this completely naive view that vascular diseases were over here and the neurological diseases were over here, that they had nothing to do with each other. But we now, so Alzheimer's was different from stroke, for example, but we now see them as being integrated. And so when it ends up being bad for the heart and bad for the carotids and everything else is also apparently playing a role in Alzheimer's disease.
Now we're on our favorite topic here at Mastering Diabetes, the topic of insulin resistance. So there seems to be a connection between insulin resistance and a lot of health conditions, but let's just take a step back here and define what exactly is insulin resistance and how does it develop?
Okay, insulin resistance means that the cells that are supposed to be responding to insulin aren't responding. Insulin is, of course, a hormone that is made in the pancreas, and it acts like a key. So when it arrives at the surface of a muscle cell, it actually attaches to an insulin receptor, just like a key in a lock, and that opens up the cell membrane to let glucose come inside. So if a person has type 2 diabetes, normally the glucose should be able to be escorted into the cell by insulin, but the cell is just not responding to that insulin very well at all. And up until comparatively recently, people reacted by saying, okay, don't eat so much sugar, don't eat carbohydrates that will release more sugar into the blood because you're insulin resistant, you can't handle it. Our response is different. Our response is to say, wait a minute, your cells are supposed to work with glucose. They should be able to take glucose out of the blood. Let's tackle the insulin resistance. Let's fix that if we can. So that raises the question of why. And we can see why. You stick the patient into an MR machine, magnetic resonance spectroscopy, and looking into the muscle and liver cells, what you discover is they're filled with microscopic fat particles. That's stopping insulin from working. So to make it short and sweet, if I can get fat, accumulated fat, out of the muscle cells will respond to insulin again, and the sugar can get into the cell and out of the blood, and my diabetes should get better or even go away if it's type 2. If I've got type 1, the same thing will occur, except I can greatly reduce my insulin need, but I'm not going to completely eliminate the need for taking some insulin.
Okay, so this is actually super helpful because you're also a master of teasing apart the difference between sort of the long-term difference between low carbohydrate diets versus low fat diets. So can you talk a little bit about how a low carbohydrate, high fat diet influences the development of insulin resistance?
Yeah, I have to say I'm really kind of troubled by this, that we're seeing a whole lot of periodic enthusiasm for a low carbohydrate diet. It started with Atkins, and then it kind of died out, and then came back as South Beach, and then it sort of died out, and it came back as ketogenic diets. And when these low carbohydrate diets recur, you can sort of understand why that would be the case, because people have high blood sugars, and they figure if I stop eating sugar and carbohydrates that turn to sugar, my blood sugar will fall, and it does. But you're not really attacking the source of the issue, which is the buildup of fat inside muscle cells and inside liver cells. So now when people go on low carbohydrate diets, because carbohydrates are, 50 or 60% of what a person eats. I'm talking about all your fruits and beans and whole grains and so forth, starchy vegetables. If you take all that away, you are eliminating a lot of calories, and people will lose weight. And if they lose weight, they're going to lose some body fat. And if they lose enough fat, you will sometimes see their glycemic numbers improving, that their A1C might come down and so forth. The problem, well, there are many problems, but from my standpoint, the biggest problems that we are left with is that the foods that remain in the diet are meats, gravy, foods that tend to cause cholesterol to rise. And the reason that's such a problem is that what's going to kill a person with diabetes in most cases, is vascular disease. Their blood vessels are being attacked, their heart is being attacked, the tiny blood vessels to their eyes or the tiny blood vessels in their kidneys are being attacked by this disease. So you don't want to raise cholesterol levels. You don't want cholesterol in your diet at all. And there have been a couple of recent studies, fairly large studies, where we've seen increases in bad cholesterol on the order of about 10 or 11% on average in people doing these low-carb diets. If you take a population of people and you raise the average bad cholesterol by 10%, that's a lot more vascular disease than we would otherwise have. So I'm concerned about people jumping on these diets, hoping for short-term weight loss, but ignoring the long-term risk.
Would you say that a low-carbohydrate diet worsens insulin resistance? It makes somebody more insulin resistant?
It can. The effects of these are really varied. Yes, I think it certainly can. If you're eating, a typical case is this: a person hears that if they avoid carbs, they're going to lose weight, and so they avoid carbs, but they end up eating more fatty foods, and they may end up not losing much weight because their calorie intake hasn't really fallen very much, and then now more and more fat is getting packed into their cells, and that's a person who discovers they're getting a real double whammy. Their blood sugar doesn't get better, their weight loss is nothing to brag about. And everything else gets worse, where their lipids get worse, and often autoimmune conditions get worse. And that's a person who then abandons the low-carb diet, starts swearing at it. In other cases, there are some people who will do it as sort of a semi-starvation kind of thing, where they're really avoiding so many sources of calories that they do actually genuinely lose weight. And it wouldn't surprise me to see in some cases their insulin sensitivity actually improving a bit. But it strikes me as the hardest possible way to do it and the most dangerous way to do it. Because again, you want to bring into your diet the things that will protect you. That's things that lower your cholesterol, but also the foods that protect your cholesterol. Keep this in mind. You know, all these particles of LDL cholesterol circulating in your blood, what makes them get sucked into the artery wall is because the LDL particles are oxidized. And we need antioxidants in our diet to a rich degree to protect them. So that's fruits and vegetables and all of the good micronutrients that they contain. So when you raise your cholesterol and you take out all your antioxidants, you're really asking for trouble.
So you've touched on the connection of insulin resistance and people living with diabetes to cardiovascular challenges. What other conditions stem from insulin resistance, and how can they be prevented?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of other conditions really that stem from this diet process, and I want to focus on that for just a minute. When a person greatly increases their meat consumption, then we have the risk not only of Alzheimer's that we talked about earlier, and to put a number to it, the Chicago Health and Aging Project back in 2003 showed that people eating the most saturated fat had 2 to 3-fold higher Alzheimer's risk compared to people eating the least. So that's risk number one. Risk number two is what happens in your digestive tract, where all this meat and so forth is going, meat and gravy and heavy cream is going down. We see higher risk of colorectal cancer in people eating meat. This is particularly true for red meat and processed meat. And unfortunately, we've seen in the low-carb camp the idea that you can't be harmed by eating a whole lot of meat. And unfortunately, that's a great concern. So some of us refer to low-carb eating as sort of a faith-based diet. In other words, you have faith that all the scientists so far have been wrong, that hopefully cholesterol won't hurt me, and hopefully meat won't give me colorectal cancer, and it hopefully won't affect my brain. But I have to say, I think science up until now has given us really good clues about what foods put us at risk. And all of those are front and center in this kind of diet.
Okay, so earlier you actually touched on something that I think was really important, which is that when people adopt a low carbohydrate diet, whether it's a paleo diet or a South Beach diet or an Atkins diet or a ketogenic diet, they often find that they lose weight. And as a result of the weight loss, their A1C comes down, their blood glucose comes down, and they can improve maybe even their blood pressure. Is it true that weight loss is required in order to elicit those results and improvement in diabetes health? Or is it possible for somebody to adopt a low carbohydrate diet, not lose any weight, and then still improve other metrics of their diabetes health?
I would be surprised if that were the case. Now, if you go on a completely plant-based diet, no animal products, keep oils low, even, let's say a person's already skinny and they don't lose any more weight, but you will see their diabetes improve, you'll see their LDL improve, you'll see their blood pressure improve, independent of weight loss. When people go on low carbohydrate diets, the quality of the diet is so bad that you're typically not going to see these other improvements. Now, when a person loses weight, by any means, it doesn't, whether you're going on a low-fat diet or a carb-restricted diet or you're fasting or whatever it is, typically your total cholesterol drops about 1 point on average for every pound you lose. So no matter how you lose weight, people's cholesterols improve. But the exception to this has been low carb, where you see people losing weight because they're avoiding so many foods that they would normally eat. But because their foods are high fat, high cholesterol, there you see the average person's cholesterol, instead of falling, it actually worsens. There's a lot of variability, though. There are some people who will swear they see a big cholesterol drop. That's what should happen, paralleling weight loss. But there are a lot where they rise. Sometimes they rise to a frightening degree. And so we see cardiovascular risk going kind of off the scale there.
Yeah, absolutely. I see exactly where you're coming from here. So let's touch a little bit on the research that you've performed over the course of your career. You've led and conducted numerous research projects at PCRM. You've published in journals like Diabetes Care and the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Can you tell us what you know about the connection between plant-based diets and beta cell function?
Right. I have to say, we weren't intending to be able to show that beta cell function would improve. And by the way, for anybody who's a little bit new to what we're talking about, the beta cells are in the pancreas. Those are the ones that make insulin. And we took a much more naive view of this at first. We were just looking at observational studies. People who have followed mostly plant-based diets tend to be thinner. Their risk of diabetes was much less. So we thought, all right, let's test it. And we started doing tests in people with type 2 diabetes. And man, is the low-fat vegan diet helpful for them. It helps a number of people to reduce their medications, maybe get off them. It reduces hemoglobin A1C much more than a conventional diet. In our NIH trial that we began in 2003, we found that the average person who was medication stable, you're not changing their medications, you're not changing their exercise, you're trying to keep everything stable, but their A1C dropped about 3 times more than on a conventional diet. And then we've applied this in a lot of other conditions. But more recently, we started looking at beta cell function. The importance of this is that type 2 diabetes starts with insulin resistance, where the muscles are acting up and not taking insulin's direction. The beta cells have to make more insulin. And then when the beta cells start wearing out, they can't keep up, and the person is diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So what we recently found is that in the course of people using a plant-based diet, not only does their insulin resistance improve, their beta cells start to improve. Start to improve their function as well. We're continuing to look at that, and we're doing some follow-up work here as well. And it raises the question of why. And I don't know the answer yet, but I'll tell you what I suspect. In the same way as in the muscle cells, we see the buildup of fat within the cells interfering with the mitochondria, which are the little furnaces inside the cells. Fat builds up in the muscle cells. The mitochondria don't work very well anymore. Insulin can't signal it very well. Same thing happens in the liver. We think something similar is happening in the beta cells of the pancreas, where the fat accumulation is interfering with their function. And if we get the fat out, maybe they respond better. So we'll see, but it raises the intriguing possibility that not only are you attacking type 2 diabetes by getting the insulin resistance taken care of, but you're actually improving the pancreas's ability to produce insulin to keep up better. And then it raises also other questions for what about a person who's teetering on the edge of type 1? It may be in a family where you know that there's a big family history of type 1 diabetes, and let's say everybody is raised breastfeeding as opposed to being exposed to cow's milk antigens, and you do everything you can to prevent this. Could you protect and restore the beta cells so that you have lifelong beta cell function? Remains to be seen, but I think it would be a wonderful thing to test.
I'm telling you, Dr. Barnard, it's a fascinating topic with so much new information being discovered about type 1.5 diabetes and people having, compromised beta cell production with some antibodies, and what's possible, what can be happen, what's potentially possible with early intervention. Can you preserve that beta cell function and make their life a heck of a lot easier? It's really interesting research, so it's cool to see you guys doing that.
Yes.
In your book, The Cheese Trap, you talk about how certain foods are as addictive as drugs. Can you tell us more about the addictive nature of processed foods?
I started noticing this in our diabetes research studies where people would do great on plant-based diets, but when you ask them, how do you like the diet? And they would love the diet, but a number of them would miss cheese, specifically cheese. I thought, why is that? It smells like old socks. Why do people crave it so much? And what we discovered is that there are actually opioids in cheese. They are coded into the protein, the milk protein, called casein, C-A-S-E-I-N. It actually has opioid molecules that break apart when you're digesting the casein, and they come into the brain. They attach to the same receptors that heroin would attach to, and they have a very mild narcotic effect. And there's a little bit of it in milk, but it's concentrated when milk is converted to cheese. So we believe that people are getting just a mild narcotic effect when they consume cheese.
That's fascinating. So many people considering a plant-based diet are concerned about their protein and omega-3 intake. For this reason, foods such as chicken and fish are still seen as health foods by many people. How can someone get their essential fatty acids from a strictly plant-based diet?
Well, first of all, with regard to protein, that question will never die, but it should have died a long time ago. And to just break it down, your body does need protein, and protein is built from individual amino acid molecules, but plants have them. They have the essential amino acids that your body does need, and a woman needs about 46 grams of protein a day, and a man about 56. That's an average. A little bit more if they're bigger or more active. If you ate a 2,000 calorie diet, which is pretty average, and if you ate 2,000 calories of nothing but broccoli, not that you would ever do this, but let's say you did that, you wouldn't think there'd be any protein in that. Well, it turns out that 2,000 calories worth of broccoli has 146 grams of pure protein. If you had 2,000 calories of lentils, it's 157 grams of pure protein. Now, hopefully, you're having some broccoli and some lentils and some rice and a variety of foods, but you're going to get more than enough protein of all the essential amino acids. Now, with regard to omega-3s, your body does get the omega-3s. These are essential fats from green leafy vegetables. There are traces of it in beans. There are some in nuts and in seeds. And your body then lengthens them to the 20 carbon and 22 carbon omega-3s that your brain needs. I think it's important not only to make sure you have a good, healthy plant-based diet, but avoid lots of extra grease in your diet. If you're dipping French fries, and pulling them out of the grease and eating them, you have too much of the unhealthy fats that are crowding the healthy fats out, and that's not a good way to go.
Got it. Okay, so here's a simple question for you. Imagine I ran into you in an elevator, and we had 30 seconds, and I said, "Hey, Dr. Barnard, if there was one thing you could say to encourage people to open their mind to a plant-based diet, what would that one thing be?"
I hope we're going up to about the 16th or 18th floor, because this might take me a few seconds to say. But I encourage people. They often hear that it's good, but their big question is, how do I start? So what I'll always say, break it into 2 steps. Take a week just to test out your vegan options, find out what you like, then take 3 weeks and actually do it all vegan all the time for a 3-week period using the foods that you identified in the first week. That just little short experience with a healthy plant-based diet is enough for people to start discovering that their blood sugar gets under better control, that they lose weight, that they feel better overall. So step 1, take a week, test out your options, take 3 weeks, do it all vegan all the time for just 3 weeks, you'll be sold.
So 3 weeks is that part of the reason why you guys created your 21-day kickstart as well?
Yeah, it's long enough that you will see benefit during that period of time. If you've got a person on insulin, and they're taking 30 units a day of insulin, and in 3 weeks on a low-fat vegan diet, very likely they're going to need to back off on their doses. So it's long enough to see results, but it's short enough that it feels easy to commit to, and people are willing to give it a try. If I say for the rest of your life you're never going to have another steak again, that sounds too daunting. So 3 weeks is our magic number.
Gotcha. Okay. So put in a plug for your new book. Feel free to brag about yourself and tell people how they can get their hands on your book and what they're going to learn.
Oh, well, thank you. I started writing this book because I was interested in hormones, not just the insulin hormone, but also sex hormones and thyroid hormone. And it started, I was sitting right here at my desk, and the phone rang. It was a young woman who had terrible, terrible menstrual cramps, and she couldn't get out of bed. And so I gave her some painkillers for a couple of days, but I also suggested a completely low-fat vegan diet, knowing that this is a way of reducing estrogen swings. And it cured her cramps. And so I then did a randomized trial, clinical trial, and showed exactly the same thing, that in large groups of women it helped. And in the course of this trial, one of the women found that her fertility, she had suffered from infertility, and magically in the second month on this diet, she became pregnant. And so we started investigating its effect on fertility, and it just became an explosion of all the different conditions where hormone imbalances are the issue, but that diet is the solution. So Your Body in Balance talks all about infertility and menstrual cramps and endometriosis and PCOS and menopausal symptoms and hormone-related cancers and hypothyroidism and hyper. And I think it's really a whole new area for those of us who are interested in food. So I'm very excited. Your Body in Balance is coming out in February.
Fantastic. I can't wait to get my hands on it as well. I feel like I've read almost every single book that you've written. And I got to say, I've been in this world of plant-based nutrition for, at this point, 17 years myself, and, read thousands of papers in the process. And every time I read another book written by another expert, especially your books, I'm still learning things. It's the way you phrase things, the way you sort of eloquently describe a complicated biological phenomenon in very simple terms. It really makes a huge difference. So if I haven't said this already, thank you so much for what you do. Thank you for educating millions of people around the planet about the power of a low-fat plant-based whole food diet. And thank you for changing the lives of countless individuals in the future.
Well, thank you for all you do. In a given day, a doctor could see only so many patients, but you have educated and inspired and reached just thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and they in turn spread the message to others. So thank you for saving lives and educating people as you have.